3:27 a.m. The airport loudspeaker cracked. Final boarding call for Flight 211 to Los Angeles. I clutched my boarding pass so tight it bent in my hand, damp with sweat. Back in our Upper East Side apartment, 40 plates sat in perfect rows, waiting for a feast I was supposed to conjure alone. The turkeys still frozen in the fridge felt like my veins. Stiff, numb, unmovable after years of carrying their weight. My phone buzzed again. Mom says the table must be flawless. Don't disappoint us. Ethan's words sliced deeper than the cold air around me. I turned the screen off. For the first time in years, silence was louder than obedience. As the jetway door sealed shut, I knew I wasn't just abandoning a dinner. I was detonating the illusion that I'd always endure. And when the engines roared to life, I smiled. Chaos was finally theirs, not mine. Would you stand with me or with them? Choose your side. My name is Rachel Carter, 31, and on paper, my life looked enviable. Marketing manager for a Manhattan tech firm, a condo with skyline views of the East River, a husband from a family that loved to flaunt its pedigree. From the outside, it sparkled. Inside, it felt hollow. Picture this, a glass-walled apartment high above the city, the lights of bridges twinkling like scattered diamonds. Work, success, loneliness. That was my trinity. I met Ethan Harper at a corporate fundraiser 3 years ago. He was polished, attentive, the kind of man who never missed an opportunity to mention his family's Harper legacy. His mother, Vivian, practically glowed that night, already evaluating me as if I were an acquisition for their brand. I ignored the chill crawling up my spine. At the time, I wanted stability more than instinct. Fast forward. Married at 28, I thought I had finally been invited into the inner circle of a family that seemed untouchable. But the invitation was conditional. I was valuable as long as I served. My promotions, my paychecks, even the industry awards I'd won. They barely earned a nod at family dinners. What mattered was whether the roast chicken was moist enough, the dessert table elegant enough. I became the unpaid event planner, chef, and emotional buffer rolled into one. Ethan liked to call it part of tradition. Vivian called it being a good wife. I called it survival. Every holiday was a performance staged in my own kitchen, yet I was never cast as the star. I was the stagehand, invisible unless something went wrong. One memory sticks with me. Last Christmas, Vivian handed me a crystal platter in front of 20 guests and announced, "Rachel insists on making everything from scratch. She thrives on it." Everyone clapped. I smiled through gritted teeth, knowing I had barely slept for 3 nights to keep up with her demands. That applause wasn't for me, it was for her. The hostess who took credit while I sweated in the background. That night, after scrubbing pans, until my hands stung, I stared out at the glittering Manhattan skyline and whispered to myself, "Is this all I'm worth? A spotless kitchen and a mother-in-law's approval?" The silence of that question haunted me. Even Ethan, the man I married, drifted further into complicity. When I begged for balance, he kissed my forehead, murmuring, "You're just so much better at this than anyone else." Praise disguised as dismissal. Each compliment tightened the chains a little more. Still, I kept performing. Because somewhere deep inside, the girl from Ohio who grew up in the shadow of a favored older sister still believed she had to prove herself worthy. And that was the cruelest part. I had trained them to expect the impossible. Every time I smiled through exhaustion, every time I made perfection look effortless, I taught them my limits didn't matter. The chandeliers of their Upper East Side townhouse glowed golden during each gathering, but to me, it always looked like a spotlight exposing my fatigue. One sentence from Ethan echoed in my head like a curse. "You're a machine at this stuff. Machines don't bleed. Machines don't break. Machines don't matter." But I did. And they were about to learn that the hard way. I didn't learn invisibility from the Harpers. I learned it long before, in a cramped two-story house in Columbus, Ohio. My older sister, Claire, was the golden child. Straight A report cards were taped to the fridge like permanent wallpaper. Every soccer goal she scored turned into a family celebration. I, 2 years younger, quieter, bookish, was the afterthought. My trophies, when they existed, were tucked onto the bottom shelf, out of sight. I still remember the sharp smell of lemon pledge in our living room the night Claire announced her acceptance to Yale. My parents cried. My grandmother brought champagne. I stood in the corner clutching a letter of my own, a full scholarship to Ohio State, a feat no one in our family had ever managed. When I tried to hand it over, my father glanced at it, muttered, "That's nice," and turned back to toast Claire. That was the first time I realized achievement didn't guarantee attention. Not when someone else shone brighter in their eyes. Foreshadowing hid in the smallest things. My mother kept a thick household ledger, a blue notebook with neat columns of expenses. I'd peek at it sometimes, hoping to understand the grown-up world. Once, I noticed my part-time job's contribution, $500 for textbooks, was written in small print, while Claire's dance camp fees, $2,000, were circled in red and labeled investment. A lesson etched itself quietly into my bones. My efforts were invisible, hers were essential. The pattern never changed. At birthdays, I got sweaters. She got jewelry. At graduation, I got a handshake. She got a car. And each slight drove me to overperform, desperate to carve out space. So I worked harder than anyone. Extra shifts at the library, honors classes, internships, no one noticed. I thought if I became indispensable, they would finally see me. But the truth was brutal. Being indispensable often means being used. That hunger for recognition followed me into adulthood. When Ethan's family praised my cooking, I mistook it for love. When Vivian complimented my dedication, I mistook it for belonging. I didn't realize I was replaying the same script from Ohio, trying to buy worth through service. The blue ledger still lives in a box under my bed, pages stiff with age. Sometimes, late at night, I flip to the one line that still burns. Rachel, $500. Nice, but not essential. That phrase has echoed through every Thanksgiving, every sleepless night over roasting pans and place settings. Because deep down, I feared that in every family I entered, I would always be the one labeled not essential. But fear only holds power until you confront it. And the day Vivian handed me a guest list for 40 names, I saw that ledger come to life again. Once more, I was expected to give everything while being written down as nothing. Something in me snapped. Quietly at first, then louder. Because I wasn't a line item in anyone's book. I was the author of my own. It was a Tuesday evening when the crack finally appeared. Vivian Harper swept into our apartment as though she owned it, which, in her mind, she practically did. The Harper Trust had helped us with the down payment, a fact she repeated like a legal clause attached to my marriage. Her heels clicked across the hardwood like a judge's gavel. Sharp. Final. "Rachel, darling," she said, in that tone that disguised commands as favors, "we need to discuss Thanksgiving arrangements." I was elbow-deep in suds, scrubbing pans from the dinner I'd just cooked. Ethan's favorite pot roast, exactly as she'd taught me years ago. My hands were raw from the water, but I'd long since learned never to wear gloves. Vivian once told me they made me look unprofessional. I forced brightness into my voice. "Of course. What can I do to help?" Ethan barely looked up from his phone. Just a glance exchanged with his mother, a silent signal I wasn't invited into. Vivian slid a folded sheet of paper from her purse with the solemnity of presenting evidence in court. She placed it on the counter. I wiped my hands and unfolded it. Names sprawled across the page. Dozens. 38 confirmed, she said. But we should plan for 40. People always bring extras 40. The number clanged in my chest like a dropped tray. I tried to swallow. 40 people? By myself? Vivian laughed, high and brittle like crystal breaking. Nonsense. You've gotten so good at this. Everyone raves about your dinners, Ethan finally spoke. You got this, babe. You always do. He didn't even lift his eyes from the glowing screen in his hands. I stared at the paper again, hoping I'd miscounted. But, no, the list was real. Names from the country club, Ethan's colleagues, distant cousins. I wasn't even on it. I was cooking for 40 people and somehow not considered a guest at my own table. Vivian produced another sheet, covered in her precise handwriting. Here's the menu. Turkey with 3 stuffings, ham with glaze, 8 side dishes, 4 desserts. Oh, and the Sanders boy has a gluten allergy, so make sure everything is adjusted accordingly. We wouldn't want a liability issue. The room tilted. Vivian, this is more than a restaurant kitchen handles, and it's 3 days away. She waved a manicured hand, dismissing me as though I'd complained about the weather. You'll manage. You always do. I looked at Ethan, searching for recognition, for solidarity, for anything. He shrugged. I can carve the turkey and open the wine. Carve the turkey. Open the wine. That was his idea of help for a production that would demand 16 straight hours of labor. The stuffing was a little dry last year, Vivian added, her eyes sharp. Do make sure everything's perfect this time. The stuffing. The one she'd specifically requested again because everyone else had loved it. The one I'd made while juggling 6 other dishes alone. My mouth said, of course. I'll make sure it's perfect. But inside, something cold settled like ice in my stomach. Later that night, after Ethan fell asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a calculator, trying to make the numbers work. 1 oven, 2 turkeys, 8 sides, 40 mouths. The math was impossible. And then I noticed something else on the list. A missing name. Sophie, Ethan's cousin, recently divorced, uninvited without explanation. That's when my breath caught. Because I saw the pattern. The moment you stopped being useful to Vivian, you disappeared. And I realized I was 1 holiday away from being erased myself. That night, after Vivian's heels had faded down the hallway and Ethan's snoring filled the bedroom, I sat in the kitchen under the harsh white light. The guest list still lay on the counter, its columns of names staring at me like a jury. I picked it up again, my fingers trembling. 38 confirmed, 40 to be safe. But my name was nowhere. I was labor, not family. I pulled out my laptop and opened a spreadsheet. Turkeys, 16 pounds each. Roasting time, 4 hours. But I only had 1 oven. Side dishes, 8. Prep time, at least 10 hours. Desserts, 4, with scratch pie crusts because store-bought just won't do. Even if I woke at 3 a.m. and worked non-stop, the math collapsed. It wasn't just impossible, it was inhuman. I felt tears sting my eyes, hot against the exhaustion pooling in my bones, but I forced them back. Machines don't cry. That was what Ethan saw me as, what Vivian demanded. A machine. And yet, I wasn't. I picked up the list again. That's when I noticed the blank space at the bottom where Sophie's name should have been. Sophie, divorced last spring, was suddenly too inconvenient for Harper's dinners. I thought of her sitting alone in her small apartment, cut out the moment her life got messy. The pattern was clear. Vivian pruned the family tree like a gardener cutting away branches that no longer bloomed. A chill ran through me. If I failed this dinner, if 1 dish came out late, 1 dessert less than perfect, what stopped her from pruning me too? The silence pressed in, heavier than the city's roar outside. My phone buzzed. A message from Ethan, though he was asleep in the next room. Don't stress. You'll figure it out. You always do. I stared at the words until they blurred. A command wrapped in reassurance. A dismissal wrapped in affection. Something cracked inside me. Not a loud shatter. Just a fissure, like the first hairline crack in a dam that had held too much for too long. I placed the note back on the counter and whispered into the empty room, "What if I didn't?" The question hung there, shocking in its simplicity. What if I didn't pull off the impossible this time? What if the plates stayed empty, the turkey frozen, the guests disappointed? What if I walked away? I imagined Vivian's face, sharp with outrage, Ethan's confusion, 40 relatives blinking at an empty table. The image terrified me and thrilled me. My eyes drifted to the blue ledger tucked in the corner of a box near the pantry. I hadn't opened it in years, but I knew what it said. $500. Nice, but not essential. My childhood was written in ink. My adulthood is playing out the same way. I pressed my palms flat against the table, feeling the wood dig into my skin. The thought rose again, clearer this time. I am not a line item. I am not a machine. And as dawn began to bleed through the window, I looked at the frozen turkeys and pictured something impossible, leaving them behind. Wednesday morning, the grocery store opened at 6 a.m., and I was there before the lights fully flickered on. The aisles smelled faintly of bleach and despair. My cart groaned under the weight of 3 turkeys, 2 hams, crates of vegetables, sacks of flour and sugar, and more dairy than any sane household should consume in a month. The checkout total made my hands shake as I swiped our joint credit card. Ethan would see the charge later and probably joke about feeding an army. I wasn't laughing. Back home, the kitchen transformed into a war zone. Every counter is covered with ingredients. Every surface claimed by mixing bowls and pans. The refrigerator bulged like it might burst. By noon, I had been chopping, seasoning, and pre-cooking for 6 hours straight. My back ached, my feet throbbed, and my hands were raw from washing vegetables until my skin burned. That's when Ethan wandered in, still in his pajamas, coffee mug in hand. He stretched like a man on vacation, not a soldier arriving at a battlefield. "Wow, you're really going all out this year," he said, surveying the chaos. "Smells good already." I was elbow-deep in stuffing, my hands coated in breadcrumbs and raw egg. "Can you help me get this into the bird?" "I can't manage it alone." He glanced at his watch. "Actually, I promised the guys I'd meet them for a quick round of tennis. Pre-holiday tradition, you know, but I'll be back in plenty of time to carve the turkey tomorrow." Tennis, while I drowned. "Ethan," I said quietly, almost pleading, "I need real help." He laughed, kissed my flour-dusted cheek and said, "You're a machine at this, babe. Machines don't need backup." And then he was gone. The words clanged in my ears long after the door shut. Machine. My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Machines don't get tired. Machines don't bleed. Machines don't break. But I wasn't a machine. I was a woman standing alone in a kitchen, drowning under a tidal wave of expectation. By 5 p.m., Vivian called. Her voice rang crisp as glass. "Just checking in, dear. How are the preparations coming along?" I looked around at the battlefield, mountains of dirty dishes, half-prepped vegetables, pots bubbling like cauldrons. My hands were cracked and bleeding from constant scrubbing. "Fine," I lied. "Everything's fine." "Wonderful." Her tone sharpened. "Oh, I forgot to mention, the Sanders boy has a severe gluten allergy." "Life-threatening. So you'll need to adjust all recipes accordingly." I froze. Half my carefully prepped side dishes contained bread or flour, the rolls, the stuffing, the desserts. Contaminated. "Vivian, You'll figure it out. You're so good at these details, click." She hung up. I stood in the silence, surrounded by 12 hours of work I now had to redo, and felt something crack inside. Not break completely, just a fissure, like the first fault line in an earthquake waiting to swallow everything. When Ethan returned that night, he smelled of sweat and beer, cheerful from his tradition. He poked his head into the kitchen. "Everything ready for tomorrow's marathon?" "There's a problem," I said. "Half the menu has gluten and now apparently there's an allergy." He shrugged. "So make different versions." "No big deal." "No big deal?" My voice rose. "That's 3 more dishes, Ethan. On top of everything else. I can't do it alone. You're better at cooking than I am. And Mom specifically requested your stuffing. People expect your food, the way he said your food, as if it were a commodity, not an act of labor." "Then maybe people can expect your food this year," I snapped, surprising even myself. His smile faltered. For the first time in years, I let my exhaustion bleed into my voice. "I need help, Ethan. Real help. Not carving turkey, not opening wine. Help." He looked almost offended. "I have that conference call with Singapore tomorrow morning. Big client. I can't exactly cancel, but I'll be around later." I stared at him. Later. Always later. When he disappeared into the living room, I collapsed into a chair. My body shook, not from exhaustion, but from rage. I pressed my forehead into my hands and whispered, "What if I don't?" The question scared me and thrilled me. The ledger flashed in my mind again, the line item that read, "Rachel, $500, not essential." I realized Vivian saw me the same way. A resource to be spent. Disposable. I rose, walked to the fridge, and stared at the frozen turkeys. They looked back at me like silent witnesses. The room hummed with the sound of the dishwasher, the steady tick of the clock. And I thought, what if I let it all collapse? For the first time in years, the thought didn't feel like failure. It felt like freedom. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint city sirens drifting up from the street below. I should have been chopping vegetables, double prepping dishes, rewriting menus to make them gluten-free. Instead, I sat in front of Ethan's laptop, my hands still trembling from the fight we'd had an hour earlier. He had left the computer open, a tab blinking with unread emails. Ethan rarely logged out, but I rarely snooped. Too busy proving I was trustworthy, too afraid of what I might find. Tonight, exhaustion pushed me past that line. I clicked. The subject line stabbed at me. Trust account, holiday coordination. Harper Family Holdings, property discussion. My pulse thudded as I opened one. Vivian's words scrolled across the screen in her precise, clipped style. "Ethan, as long as Rachel continues to manage holiday obligations flawlessly, we can move forward with transferring the apartment title into the Harper Family Trust. It secures the property for future generations and ensures family assets stay where they belong. She needn't concern herself with the paperwork. Just keep her focused on the domestic duties, where she shines." I read the lines 3 times, each word slicing deeper. My stomach turned cold. The apartment, my home, wasn't truly ours. It was bait, held out like a prize for obedience. Another email, 2 weeks older, revealed more. "I've already diverted part of her inheritance into the trust when she wasn't looking. Small amount, but symbolic. If she balks, remind her of everything we've given her. She'll comply. She always does." My throat closed. Inheritance. The savings my grandmother left me, the one thing that had felt wholly mine, had been siphoned, disguised as part of the down payment gift. I clutched the edge of the desk. The room spun. Foreshadowing clicked into place. The blue ledger from my childhood, with its cruel little note, "Rachel, $500, not essential." And now here it was again, playing out in adulthood. My efforts are invisible. My worth was written off in the margins. My name is missing from the guest list, and my money is erased from the accounts. I whispered into the empty room, "Not essential. Not essential." The words tasted like poison. For years I had believed that cooking, cleaning, hosting, and performing would buy me a seat at their table. But the truth was laid bare on that glowing screen. I wasn't family. I was leveraging a means to an end. The dam inside me cracked wider. A message pinged in. A fresh email, time-stamped just minutes ago. From Vivian. Ethan, confirm Rachel is on schedule. 40 guests is ambitious, but she thrives under pressure. Remember, presentation is everything. We cannot afford embarrassment in front of the Sanders. If she falters, it reflects on the Harper name, not hers. My vision blurred. Even now, while I was drowning, she wrote about me as though I were a subcontractor. She thrives under pressure. I was a machine in her eyes, a piece of equipment she could run until the motor burned out, then replace. I slammed the laptop shut, my breath ragged. The silence afterward was deafening. I stumbled into the kitchen. The counter was still covered with bowls, knives, and spices scattered like evidence. The turkeys in the fridge loomed behind the glass, pale and rigid. Their frozen bodies reflected back at me like a mirror, lifeless, waiting to be carved. I pressed my hands flat against the counter until the wood bit into my palms. My heart thundered. Rage, betrayal, terror. They all tangled inside me. They stole from me. They used me. And they thought I'd never find out. For years, I'd convinced myself the Harper family's demands were about tradition, appearances, maybe even affection twisted in strange shapes. But this was darker. This was a calculated control. I thought of Sophie again, uninvited the moment she became inconvenient. That was the warning. The fate waiting for me once my usefulness expired. But now, I held the key. My phone buzzed with a new message from Ethan. Don't overthink this, babe. Just get some sleep. You'll crush it tomorrow like always. I laughed out loud, the sound jagged, almost hysterical. Like always. He didn't know I had read the emails, didn't know the mask had shattered. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt dangerous. I walked back to the fridge and opened it. The blast of cold air hit me, sharp against my face. I stared at the turkeys again. They weren't just food, they were symbols. 40 pounds of expectation, frozen solid, waiting to chain me down. And for the first time, I imagined leaving them behind. The ledger, the missing name, the emails. All the foreshadowing had converged into a single undeniable truth. If I stayed, I'd disappear piece by piece until there was nothing left of me. But if I left, if I detonated the illusion, everything would collapse for them instead. I closed the fridge, the door sealing with a heavy thud, and whispered, "Let it collapse." The glow from Ethan's laptop still burned in my mind long after I slammed it shut. The words of Vivian's email had carved themselves into my chest like scars. She needn't concern herself with the paperwork. Just keep her focused on domestic duties. Focused, contained, controlled. I sat at the kitchen table, the guest list lying there like a taunt. 38 names, 40 mouths. My own is missing. Sophie erased. My inheritance was siphoned. The apartment is not mine. The silence of the apartment was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator, like a machine breathing steadily. I realized with a shiver, it sounded like me. Always steady. Always functioning. Always producing. Until now. I reached for my phone, not even sure why. My hands moved on instinct, scrolling, searching. A travel site blinked open. I told myself I was only looking. Just to see. Just to imagine. The first result stole my breath. Thanksgiving getaway to Los Angeles. Departure, 4:15 a.m. Return, Sunday. Limited seats. The price was steep. Ethan would call it reckless. Vivian would call it selfish. But it was my money too, wasn't it? At least the portion of it they hadn't already stolen. My finger hovered over the screen. The cursor pulsed like a heartbeat. I imagined the scene. 3:30 a.m., when I was supposed to be basting turkeys, kneading dough, scalding my hands in endless suds. Instead, I'd be boarding a plane. The final call echoed in the terminal. Their perfect dinner was collapsing behind me like a house of cards. The thought terrified me and thrilled me. I closed my eyes. The ledger appeared in my mind. The line that branded me not essential. I saw Sophie's face when she told me Vivian had cut her out. I saw Ethan's texts, each one wrapping dismissal in endearment. I saw the emails, cold and precise, stripping me of ownership, of recognition, of worth. And then I saw myself, a year from now, bent over another mountain of dishes. Still invisible, still a machine, still not essential. No, I whispered into the quiet. Not anymore. My thumb pressed down. Book a flight. The confirmation screen appeared, bright and final. My name, my birth date, my seat assignment. A party of one. For the first time in years, my name stood alone, unchained from anyone else's expectations. Rachel Carter. Not Ethan's wife, not Vivian's daughter-in-law. Just me. A tremor ran through me, half fear, half exhilaration. I packed in silence, moving through the apartment like a ghost. A small suitcase. Nothing extravagant. Sundresses I hadn't worn in years, the ones Ethan dismissed as too casual. A notebook, my grandmother's bracelet, my passport, just in case. Each item slipped into the bag felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. At 2:45 a.m., I sat at the kitchen table one last time. The guest list still lay there, heavy with names. I grabbed a pen and scribbled a note on the back. Ethan. Something came up. You'll need to handle Thanksgiving. Groceries are in the fridge. Rachel. No apology, no instructions, no smiley faces to soften the blow. For once, I let the fact stand naked and unapologetic. I folded the paper and left it beside the turkeys, like evidence in a case they would have to argue without me. The apartment was silent as I rolled my suitcase to the door. I paused, looking back. The chandeliers glowed faintly, catching the edge of the guest list. For years, those lights had felt like a spotlight on my exhaustion. Tonight, they looked like prison bars. I turned off the switch. Darkness swallowed the room. As the elevator descended, my phone buzzed with a message. Ethan, half asleep in the next room. Don't forget to set the alarm for 3:30. Big day tomorrow. Love you. I laughed under my breath, the sound bitter and sharp. Big day tomorrow. He had no idea how big. The cab ride to JFK was surreal. Empty streets, traffic lights blinking red and green over deserted intersections. The city felt like it was holding its breath. I pressed my forehead against the window, watching the familiar skyline shrink behind me. At the terminal, the agent scanned my ticket. "Holiday escape?" she asked, smiling. Something in her voice caught me off guard, like she saw me, really saw me. "Something like that," I replied. As I walked toward the gate, my phone buzzed again, a new email notification from Vivian. "Rachel, remember, no excuses this year. Guests expect perfection. I didn't open it. Didn't need to." The boarding call echoed across the terminal. Final call for Flight 211 to Los Angeles. And for the first time in my life, I walked toward a final call meant for me, not for them. The engines would roar soon, the dinner would collapse, and the machine they thought I was would finally shut down. The jetway door sealed behind me with a heavy hiss, as if the universe itself had signed off on my decision. My seatbelt clicked, the engines rumbled, and the world outside blurred into streaks of silver and black. For the first time in years, I wasn't preparing stuffing or wiping counters at 3 a.m. I was soaring above the city that had held me captive. Down below, the Harpers still slept, convinced their machine was on autopilot. But machines don't write notes and walk away. At 7:15 a.m., Ethan stumbled into the kitchen, hair mussed, eyes bleary. He expected the comforting chaos of holiday prep. The smell of onions frying, timers beeping, Rachel darting from stove to sink like a well-oiled system. Instead, he found silence. The counters were cluttered with untouched groceries. The turkeys still sat in the fridge, their pale bodies frozen stiff. On the counter, beside the guest list, lay a folded note. He opened it with one hand while sipping coffee with the other, expecting a grocery reminder. Instead, the words hit him like a punch. Ethan. Something came up. You'll need to handle Thanksgiving. Groceries are in the fridge. Rachel. He reread it 3 times, not comprehending. Handle Thanksgiving? Alone? That was impossible. She wouldn't. She couldn't. Rachel always delivered. Rachel was reliable. Rachel was a machine, except that machines don't leave notes. From the plane window, the sunrise painted the horizon gold. I felt its heat on my face. Not from an oven, but from freedom. My phone buzzed on the tray table, lighting up with Ethan's name. I flipped it face down. Then Vivian's name flashed. I turned the phone off completely. For the first time in years, silence wasn't punishment. It was power. At 11 a.m., Vivian swept into the Harper townhouse wearing pearls and authority. She expected aromas of roasted turkey, the sparkle of polished silver, the hum of Rachel's labor smoothing every detail. Instead, she was met with Ethan's frantic pacing, half-peeled potatoes strewn across the counter, and guests beginning to arrive. "What is this?" she hissed. Ethan shoved the note at her. Vivian scanned it, her face tightening with each word. "Something came up," she repeated, voice sharp. What could possibly come up on Thanksgiving morning more important than 40 guests? Her eyes darted to the frozen turkeys, then to Ethan. "You let this happen." "I didn't, she just—" he stammered, but Vivian cut him off. "No, she knew her place, she knew her duty, and now she's abandoned us?" The doorbell rang. Guests flowed in, cheerful and expectant. Vivian plastered on her hostess' smile, her fury hidden behind pearls. "We'll manage," she said through clenched teeth. "We always manage." But the kitchen told another story. Flour dusted the counters like ashes, pots boiled over, alarms beeped, and nothing coordinated. Guests whispered as they saw the chaos. The Harper's flawless image cracked in real time. At 30,000 feet, I reclined my seat and ordered orange juice. The flight attendant smiled without judgment, without expectation. I opened my notebook and wrote one line: "I am not a machine." The words looked foreign and revolutionary, scrawled in ink that no one else controlled. For years I had been programmed to serve, programmed to obey. But here I was, glitching the system, breaking the loop. The fear in my chest didn't vanish, but it reshaped itself. Fear no longer chained me, it propelled me. By 2 p.m., the Harper dining room was filled with chatter, but instead of golden turkeys and flawless sides, the table offered chaos. Undercooked potatoes, hastily bought pies still in their plastic containers, a ham burnt on one side and raw on the other. Whispers spread. "Where's Rachel? Why isn't she here?" Vivian deflected with brittle laughter. "She's unwell." But her clenched jaw told another story. Cousin Carmen, always blunt, leaned in. "Unwell? Or done?" The words rippled through the room, leaving Vivian stiff and silent. The plane touched down in Los Angeles just as 40 guests lifted their forks in confusion. Switched my phone back on long enough to snap a photo. Palm trees swaying, sky impossibly blue, my suitcase at my side. I texted it to Ethan with one line: "Tell your mother the turkey is her problem now." Then I blocked his number. The liberation was intoxicating, like stepping out of a cage I hadn't realized I'd been locked in. For years they had fed on my labor, my silence, my compliance. But today, their feast was chaos, and my feast was freedom. As I walked out of LAX, suitcase rolling behind me, my phone buzzed one last time. A notification from my bank. A transaction labeled Harper Trust Transfer, pending. My stomach dropped. Even 3,000 miles away, their hands were still in my pockets. The fight wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The sun over Los Angeles was blinding, the kind of light that made everything look sharper, more unforgiving. I dragged my suitcase across the concrete, feeling the heat rise from the pavement, my body buzzing with adrenaline. Freedom smelled like jet fuel and ocean air, but freedom also came with a sting. My phone buzzed again with that bank notification. Harper Trust Transfer, pending. My stomach tightened. Even here, 3,000 miles away, they still had hooks in me. I ducked into an airport cafe, ordered black coffee, and slid into a corner booth. My hands shook as I refreshed my bank app. The number flickered, digits rearranging like a cruel riddle. Part of my savings, what remained of my grandmother's gift, was in the process of moving. Not by me, by them. I stared at the screen, my pulse loud in my ears. They hadn't just stolen my labor. They were stealing my future. For years, I had thought the chains around me were invisible expectations, social obligations. Now I saw the real shackles were contracts, trusts, signatures buried in paperwork I'd never read. Vivian had planned this. She always planned. She dressed her control in pearls and politeness, but underneath, she was steel. My fingers hovered over the call button for Ethan. For a moment, I almost did it. Almost begged for clarity. Almost slipped back into the old script. But then I remembered the note I'd left on the counter. The turkeys still frozen. The chaos surely erupting in that townhouse kitchen. I smiled. For once, chaos was theirs, not mine. And still, chaos wasn't enough. This wasn't just about walking away from a dinner. This was about reclaiming everything they had siphoned from me. Money, ownership, self-worth. A jet roared overhead, rattling the windows. My reflection stared back at me in the cafe glass. Tired eyes, hair tangled from the flight, but a spark I hadn't seen in years. I almost didn't recognize her. That was the point. I opened my notebook, the same one I had packed in silence just hours before, and wrote a single line. Step 1. Take back what's mine. The act of writing steadied me. Machines follow programs. People make plans. And I was done being programmed. Somewhere across the country, Ethan was probably panicking, Vivian was fuming, and guests were whispering. I could picture it so vividly. Vivian smoothing her pearls, Ethan fumbling with a carving knife, someone pointing out the empty chair at the table where I used to sit. I closed my eyes and let the image sink in, not with guilt, but with a strange satisfaction. They wanted perfection. I gave them an absence louder than any performance. The first victory was mine. But the war had only begun. I paid for my coffee, stepped outside, and felt the California air hit my face, warm, salty, free. Then I turned to you, the one listening now. Tell me honestly, what would you have done? Stayed behind to feed 40 ungrateful mouths, or walked away to claim your own life? Do you side with me, the woman who finally said enough? Or with them, the family who called me a machine and erased my worth with a pen stroke? Drop your answer below. Don't just watch. Choose. Because silence is complicity. As I hailed a cab, I thought again of the final boarding call at JFK. The loudspeaker echoed through the terminal, pulling me toward a choice. That sound would stay with me forever. Not as an end, as a beginning. The cab wound its way through Los Angeles streets, palm trees swaying under the clear blue sky. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to a kitchen or a grocery store. I was rushing toward a choice. At the hotel, I opened my laptop and pulled up every document I could find: mortgage agreements, bank transfers, joint accounts. My hands shook as I scrolled, the glow of the screen revealing what I had never wanted to see. My name was there, but only as a shadow. Vivian's trust appeared everywhere, threaded through the fine print like a spider's web. I dialed a number I'd found online, a law office specializing in estate disputes. The receptionist's voice was warm and professional. "We can schedule you with Attorney Delgado this afternoon. Bring whatever records you have records, evidence, proof." Words I had always associated with other people's battles, never mine. By 3 p.m., I sat in a sleek office overlooking downtown LA, my suitcase by my side, documents spread across the polished table. Attorney Delgado adjusted his glasses, flipping through pages with a practiced eye. "Rachel," he said finally, "what you're describing is more common than you think. Family trusts are used as control mechanisms, assets funneled away under the guise of legacy. It's exploitation, and it's actionable." My throat tightened. "So I'm not crazy? They really stole from me?" He looked up, his gaze steady. "Not crazy. Trapped. But traps can be dismantled." The sentence landed with the force of a gavel. For years, I had felt insane for questioning, selfish for resisting, guilty for wanting more. Now, sitting in that office, I felt something I hadn't in years: validated. I leaned back in the chair, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For one quiet moment, the world stilled. Then the fire returned. "I want everything back," I said. "Every dollar, every signature, every piece of my name they tried to erase." Delgado nodded. "Then we'll start by freezing the transfer. We'll file an injunction first thing tomorrow. In the meantime, gather any communication that proves intent. Emails, texts, notes. Anything I thought of Vivian's messages, Ethan's dismissals, the blue ledger waiting back in my apartment. The pieces were there. All I had to do was fit them together." Walking out of that office, papers tucked under my arm, I felt taller. Not lighter, because the weight was still there, but taller. Like I had finally decided to stand instead of bow. On the sidewalk, the city pulsed with life, horns honking, strangers laughing, food trucks steaming. I let the noise wash over me, reminding me that the world was bigger than one family's chokehold. My phone buzzed again. Dozens of missed calls, voicemails piling up, Ethan's name, Vivian's name, and numbers from relatives I barely knew. My thumb hovered over play voicemail. I didn't press it. For the first time, their voices didn't control me. I looked up at the sky, at the planes carving white lines across the blue, and whispered, "This is my final boarding call." And this time, I intended to answer it with everything I had. I rented a small apartment near Venice Beach. Nothing fancy. White walls, creaky floors, a balcony that looked out over a sliver of ocean. The first night I slept there, the sound of waves crashing against the shore lulled me to sleep. No timers, no alarms, no demands. Just the rhythm of water meeting sand. In the morning, I made coffee and drank it on the balcony, barefoot, hair tangled. The sun painted the horizon pink and gold. For once, the light felt like it belonged to me. I started therapy sessions with a counselor recommended by Attorney Delgado. At first, I stumbled over my words, embarrassed to admit how much I had allowed. But the counselor, a calm woman named Leah, reminded me that endurance isn't weakness, it's survival. And choosing to stop enduring is power. Each week, I unpacked pieces of myself I had hidden away, the ambition that had landed me promotions, the creativity I had buried under recipes, the laughter I had silenced so no one could call me frivolous. Slowly, the machine unraveled and the human emerged. I reached out to Sophie, the cousin Vivian had erased. She drove 2 hours to meet me halfway. We sat at a diner booth, greasy fries between us, and shared stories like survivors comparing scars. She told me how Vivian had called her a liability after her divorce. I told her about the emails, the trust fund, and the stolen inheritance. When she laughed, sharp and bitter. I felt less alone. "Rachel," she said, "we're not broken. We're just done being quiet." Her words lodged in me, like an anchor. Week by week, I built routines that had nothing to do with serving anyone else. Evening walks along the boardwalk, journaling under the salty breeze, signing up for a pottery class just because I once loved shaping clay in college. The world didn't collapse when I said no. It expanded. One evening, I sat at the beach as the sky bled orange and purple. Children shrieked as they chased waves. Couples strolled hand in hand, and a man strummed a guitar off-key but joyfully. I let the scene wash over me. I thought about the Harper dining room, how it must have looked with its half-burnt ham, its store-bought pies, its brittle hostess, and I smiled. I wasn't there to see the whispers, but I could imagine them. Where's Rachel? Why isn't she here? For once, the answer was simple. I was here, with the ocean, with myself. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote, "I am not missing. I am found." The silence in my apartment was no longer suffocating. It was sacred. But healing wasn't just about quiet. It was about building. Therapy gave me language. Sophie gave me solidarity. The ocean gave me perspective. Piece by piece, I was assembling a life that wasn't measured by how many mouths I fed or how spotless my counters were. It wasn't easy. Sometimes, guilt crept in. Ethan's voice in my head, Vivian's commands echoing. On those nights, I'd whisper one line to myself, "Machines don't bleed." But I do. And that's my proof I'm alive. The ocean roared back in agreement. For the first time, I believed it. A year later, Thanksgiving looked nothing like the Harpers had planned. They still hosted, of course, but the guest list had shrunk from 40 names to barely 8. Half the relatives had stopped coming, embarrassed by last year's fiasco. The other half came only out of morbid curiosity. What would the Harpers do without their machine? I wasn't there. My holiday table sat in a modest apartment overlooking the ocean, candles flickering beside Sophie and a few new friends I'd made through therapy groups. We laughed, clinked glasses, passed dishes everyone had contributed. It was messy, loud, imperfect, and it was ours. Ethan showed up once, months after I left. He looked thinner, older, carrying the weight of a family image cracked in half. He begged for a second chance, promised he'd set boundaries with Mom, promised things would be different. But promises don't erase betrayals. I listened in silence, let him speak, then told him quietly, "I'm not your machine anymore." The words landed like a gavel. His shoulders slumped. He left without looking back. Vivian never came in person. She sent lawyers instead. But Attorney Delgado dismantled her paperwork, line by line, until my inheritance was restored and my name secured on my own accounts. When the ruling came, I sat on the balcony with Sophie, the ocean roaring below, and whispered, "The ledger is closed." That night, I opened my notebook and wrote the last line of my story, from not essential to myself. The phrase felt like a circle drawn complete. Now, every time I hear an airport loudspeaker call out "final boarding," I think of that night at JFK. But it no longer feels like escape. It feels like an arrival. The final call wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a life where I decided what's essential. And this is where I turn to you. What would you have done? Stayed chained to 40 guests and a mother-in-law who saw you as labor? Or walked away and faced the fallout to reclaim your worth? Do you believe loyalty means obedience, or that family without respect is no family at all? Drop your answer below. Choose your side. Because in stories like mine, silence is never neutral. As I watch the tide pull back and return, endless and certain, I know one truth. I stood up for myself. I reclaimed my worth. I am free. And the final boarding call now belongs only to me. Looking back now, it almost feels like someone else's life. The sleepless nights in a kitchen that wasn't mine, the endless lists with my name missing, the applause stolen by someone else. But it was mine. I lived it. I bled for it. And I finally chose to stop. That choice didn't come easy. Walking away terrified me more than staying ever did. But fear has a strange secret. Once you walk through it, you realize it was only smoke. I used to believe worth came from keeping plates spinning and guests fed, from applause at someone else's table. Now I know worth comes from one place only: yourself. The turkeys stayed frozen, the chandeliers dimmed, their perfection cracked, and I discovered that the world didn't end. It opened. The motif never leaves me. Every time I hear an airport loudspeaker announce final boarding call, I smile. Because that sound used to mean duty, deadlines, suffocation. Now it means freedom. My freedom. And so, if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Family is about respect, not obligation. Love is not measured in labor. And no one, no parent, no partner, no legacy, gets to decide your worth. I stood up for myself. I reclaimed my worth. And I found peace. Now I turn the question to you. Have you ever been pushed past your limit? Have you ever stayed silent when you should have walked away? Or did you, like me, finally listen to your own final boarding call? Tell me in the comments. Choose your side. Share your story. Because stories like this don't just belong to me, they belong to anyone who has ever been told they were not essential. If my story resonated, like, subscribe, and send this to someone who needs a reminder. Your worth isn't defined by others. It never was. It never will be. The final boarding call is yours. Don't miss it.